can always come back to some of those slides in a later discussion. And now I want to allow us to take some questions.
Yes, Thomas, we've already got a few questions in via the chat and via the Q&A. So let's start on that. Let me first start with, if you want to hear more about details on other topics, we will have more masterclasses. Just sign up for the petition at start.thorium.today. And if you have signed up, then you will get the newsletter. And you can always look on the website as well. But then the questions. I got a question from Liam, and they asked, like, one thorium ball is this size, 3.5 centimeters or 3.4 centimeters, but how big is the waste then in a lifetime if you see the waste that is left over of this? Can you elaborate on that, Thomas Jan?
Yes, that is a good question. So when you fission uranium, you get two fission products, and the weight of those fission products is a little bit less than the original uranium that you started from, because the difference in the weight is actually converted into energy via Einstein's famous equation. This E is equal to mc squared. So you get a little bit less. Let's just say you get 99% of the weight in the fission products. But of course, fission products are a different type of elements in the periodic table. So the density of those might be different than thorium. Thorium is a quite heavy element, and uranium as well. But when you get some of the other things, it might be actually a gas. So the density is very different. So in terms of waste, you basically get roughly the same as the ball. So let's say the ball you need for your life is 4 centimeters. Then you get basically 3.99 centimeters something, a ball. But the density of the materials are a little bit different. So the size of the ball might be bigger, but the weight of the ball is essentially the same as the thorium ball. So this was these 235 grams. So basically you get 235 grams of waste for your entire life. And if you run it through a thorium waste burner, that only needs to be stored for 300 years. And we can easily do that in a safe way.
Thanks for that question. We got a question from Fred Walravens, and it's a more definition question. Can you explain the term waste burner again? So you mix it up with a thorium molten salt reactor and a waste burner. What do you mean by the waste burner?
Yeah, so there's a little bit different definitions out there, but in my opinion, the right definition for a waste burner is something where you get less amount of waste than you started with. But it's a little bit complex because there's two things with the waste. There's the amount of radioactivity, and then there's the volume of the waste, and then there's also how many years it takes for this radioactivity to decay down to small levels. And when we say 300 years, it's not because it's completely gone after 300 years. It's because the radioactivity that is left after 300 years is comparable to the background radiation or radiation sources that you find in nature already. So it simply means that it's less radioactive than things you find out in nature. Anyways, and so for our waste burner, we try to do all the things. We try to take the original spent nuclear fuel from light water reactors, and then we try to reduce the amount. And next, we also try to reduce the amount of years that it needs to be stored. And then we also try to make the radioactivity less. But in that respect, I have to say that fission products are more radioactive in the beginning, right after the fission. They are much more radioactive than plutonium, for example. But of course, they have a much shorter half-life, so they are not radioactive for as long a time. So you basically have to look at these curves of how much radioactivity there is from the waste form, and then you have to look at the amount, and then you have to decide for yourself whether you prefer something that only needs to be stored for a short amount of time, and maybe it's a little bit more radioactive in the first couple of years, or you'd rather have something that is not very radioactive. And if we look at spent nuclear fuel, maybe I had a slide about that. Let me just go up a little bit. Yeah, this slide here. So if we look at spent nuclear fuel from light water reactors, 95% or more of that fuel is uranium. And it's exactly the same uranium as you got out of the ground. So, I mean, in nuclear terms, there's international treaties that says that we have to keep track of this uranium because, of course, it can also be used for bombs. So we have decided that this is source material and there's rules in place that we must keep track of every little minute amount of it. But that doesn't mean that it's dangerous because it comes from nature and it could actually go back into nature. But because we have agreed internationally that we must keep track of it, we cannot put it back into nature. So it's not dangerous, but it's there. And then there's actually a YouTube video of a guy who's eating uranium oxide, and that just goes to show that you can even eat this stuff. It's not more dangerous than that. But anyways, it's considered nuclear waste because of those international treaties. And what we want to do in Copenhagen Atomics is we want to split this. We want to take these 95% of the uranium away from the other 4.4%. And when we do that, if we make a very clean separation, then we can actually sell this uranium back to the uranium market, the international uranium market. It's still being tracked, but then we have converted it from something that is called waste to something that is called a product you can sell. So by doing that, we have not reduced the radioactivity very much, but we have reduced the volume, the amount by 95%, which is something at least. And then we look at the other 4.4%, and then we split those also into fission products, which is the 3.3% that needs to be stored for 300 years. And they are, in the beginning, right after the fuel comes out of the reactor, they are more radioactive than the plutonium and long-lived actinides. But that only lasts for a few years, and the first 10 years you can easily store it inside one of these fuel pools where it basically sits in a swimming pool of water. And then after 10 years, you're already down to levels where it's manageable. And then after 300 years, you're all the way down to levels where it has less radioactivity than that uranium that we've already sold to the international market. And then finally, we have the plutonium and the long-lived actinides. And they are radioactive for many, many years, for tens of thousands of years. But there's not very much of it. There's only 1% of it, of the total weight. And that is what we put into the waste burners, and then we convert that into fission products, because we believe that fission products is less of a problem for us humans than this plutonium and long-lived actinides. So I'm sorry it was a little long answer, but I hope.
We also slowly go to the next question, but basically you called it a waste burner because you want to have nuclear waste seen as not nuclear waste, but actually valuable for a thorium reactor.
Yes.
Okay. Jasper de Rede asked a lot about efficiency. So, and Henk van der Linden also. First of all, he asked 100% efficiency, and I think you already explained a bit that there is in the process a little bit less efficiency. But later on, he also asked, gas electric is about 60% max efficiency. And how is it with thorium? What is the efficiency ratios?
Yes, yeah, so basically in any process we convert heat into some rotation, and then that rotation can produce electricity or turn a wheel in a bus or a train or whatever, or a propeller on a ship. So we have to look at those different efficiencies of how we convert heat into rotation. And that has nothing to do with thorium energy. It's just, we can use those different processes, like the steam cycle I talked about, like the Brayton cycle I talked about. And the efficiency is usually around 30–40% efficiency when you convert heat into rotation. And it goes, that doesn't matter if it's thorium or a coal-fired power plant, it's all the same. But the thing with thorium is, of course, that you have a high temperature. You run at 700 degrees, and that gives you better efficiency than if you were running at 300 degrees.
Okay. And then what if you use hydrogen as a storage medium? Would that be a different efficiency, do you think? That's from Henk.
Yeah, no. I mean, uh, you can store the energy in hydrogen or in liquid fuels or in other gases. I mean, there's for different types of storage media, there's an efficiency when you convert it from, for example, electricity and heat. You need those two things to convert things into liquid fuel. And in general, it's easier to store things as liquid fuel than it is to store it as hydrogen. Simply because hydrogen is a gas and it's not. I know that hydrogen has a very positive vibe in the media, but it's not as good as storing things as ammonia, for example. Um, but yeah.
Okay. And then Peter Smit asked two questions. The one is you show in your presentation that a thorium reactor has a deployment speed 1,000 times faster as a light water reactor. And he says, is that wishful thinking if I translate it freely, or is it a real accurate estimate?
At least it's an estimate because nobody has ever deployed molten reactors from an assembly line, so it can only be an estimate. But it's, from an engineering perspective, it seems almost impossible to create the type of light water reactors we know in classical nuclear reactors with these big buildings with these high pressure tanks. It seems impossible to manufacture those on an assembly line. And I think everybody will agree that it's possible to make molten reactors on an assembly line, and this is what makes the difference. It's a much smaller machine. The machine is the size of the machine, and the amount of material that goes into the machine is much smaller, like maybe 100 times less, and therefore you can make it on an assembly line. And I think everybody agrees that we can manufacture cars and trucks and airplanes on assembly lines, and we can do that quite fast already. So I would not say it's a proof, but I think there's a good indication that this is the case.
Good. What you often say when we have talks, Thomas Jan, is like, yeah, if you're an engineer and you look at it, you sometimes say, yeah, if you have a basement, you can almost build this thing by yourself. That's how simple the engineering looks like.
Yeah.
Good. Peter Smit also had a question. Why has waste from thorium a much shorter life than a light water reactor?
Yeah, so it has to do with this. I'll just go up a little bit here. This chart here. I hope you can still see the slides. This chart here shows the different routes that when you have neutrons that interact with the atoms in a nuclear reactor, those atoms are converted to other atoms. This is what a nuclear reactor does, whether it's a fusion or a fission reactor. And this particular calculation I showed here is for a thorium reactor. But if you do the same calculation for a reactor based on uranium-235, then you will get into this one that over on the very right side, there's uranium-238. This is basically the main ingredients in light water reactors. So this whole chart starts over there at uranium-238, and then it goes further out to the right and further down to the downwards. And I haven't included those numbers here in this chart because this chart is only about thorium. But the thing is that when you have these neutrons interact with your uranium-238 and also the subsequent elements that are created from that, you create some of these things, like you can see part of them here. Neptunium is down there, Neptunium-238. There's plutonium and there's californium and all these other elements that is not found in nature. And unfortunately, they have a very long half-life. So they are radioactive for tens of thousands or even 100,000 years. And it's because the way these neutrons interact with those elements that you create 1,000 times more of these elements that are more radioactive. And this is the reason why we need a waste burner to convert those back into fission products.
Okay. I think also on the radiation and the decay and stuff, we will create a master class also at a point, right, Thomas?
Yep.
Then Paul Schalk has a really good question. I'll read the whole question. Although the technology is long known and I believe already tried in the USA, what's the reason that currently the development of new working reactor is specified is very hard? He asks expensive and a couple of decades of engineering. It's a very interesting question because I think it's also perception and what is expensive and is it expensive and does it really take a couple of decades still to engineer? Because I think different engineers have different opinions, and I definitely know Thomas Jan has an opinion, so I'll give the word to him to give the answer on how long it will take. Is it very hard? Is it very expensive? One thing I like when I have talked to Thomas Jan, but also others, is if you look at a light water reactor, it takes decades to build now, but when we designed it, if you look in the past, in 3-4 years, a light water reactor in the 60s was developed and deployed. So there's also other reasons, I think, but Thomas Jan can very well allude on that, I think.
Yeah, it's a completely a question about human perception. It's not really about engineering. If like you said, if we go back to some of the very first reactors that was ever built in this world, and I'm happy to say that one of the first ones that was ever built is the Hanford B reactor at the Hanford site in state of Washington in the USA, and it's now a museum. So everybody from the topic can go there and have a look. And I think if you're interested in nuclear reactors, it will be a great experience for you to go there and look at it. Because that's one of the very first reactors they built. And they were not able to do any computer simulations back then. So they just had to put it together like, of course, they did some calculations on a blackboard and so on before they built it to kind of know what size it should have. And then they built it, and it took 11 months from they started digging in the ground till the chain reaction was running. And it turned out, so they had the calculations they had made on the blackboard showed that it was probably something like 250 megawatt. But then once they got it up and running, they had designed the cooling system for 250 megawatt, but they could see that they could easily go higher than that. So later on, after the war, they added a new cooling system, which was capable of doing 2.5 gigawatts. And it turns out that reactor was actually, they could run it at 2.5 gigawatts. So the reactor was 10 times bigger than they thought when they built it. And then once they had installed the new cooling system, they ran it for 2.5 gigawatt for the next 25 years without any problems. So this goes to show you that people without computers, just with a blackboard, they can construct a nuclear reactor, and they can even get it run by a factor of 10, and it'll still turn on, it'll still work, and it's safe, and they can run it for 25 years. And a 2.5 gigawatt reactor is a really, really big reactor, even for today's standards. So this is where we started. And then everything went wrong after that, because then it started to take longer and longer time. So if you go through history and look at those reactors, you can look that up on Wikipedia. And you can see that in the beginning, it usually took, in the 50s, it usually took 2 or 3 or 4 years to build a reactor. And most of those reactors they built in the 50s were all new designs. There were new concepts, new ways of doing things. And still, it only took a few years to build them and get them up and running. And almost all of them worked. And now I'm talking thermal reactors. That means thermal neutrons. That means neutrons that are moderated, or they are flying slow, you can say. So all of those reactors basically worked. And of course, then back then in the 50s, they got very excited about this, because they thought this stuff is easy, you know. This is something you can build in your basement. And back then, in the beginning of the 60s, people thought that we were going to have nuclear reactors all over the place, in cars and buses and everywhere, on ships, and just be something simple. But this is what I talked about a little bit before, because then they started to say, oh, okay, there's not enough uranium-235 to have all these reactors all over the place. So this is when they started to develop the fast reactors. And this is where things became complicated. And the way I picture it in my mind is that a fast reactor in terms of difficulty, it's halfway between a thermal reactor and a fusion reactor. Fusion reactors are super difficult. And we know that. We've been trying now for, 70, 80 years, and it's still not working. And fast reactors is easier than fusion, but it's still hard. And there were some of the biggest countries in the world, they spent billions of dollars on fast reactors, and they never got any viable reactors out of it that were good enough that they want to build a second one. Anyways, so for thermal reactors, that's also the main reason that Copenhagen Atomics wants to build a thermal reactor. It's because this stuff is super simple, and it can almost be built in your basement. But nowadays, because of the accident in the 3 Mile Island, the Chernobyl in the 70s and 80s, there's all kinds of regulations, and there's all kinds of things. And also this whole concept that people think nuclear is dangerous leads to nobody wants to approve it, because if something happens, then it's their ass on the line. So they want to make extra super duper sure that nothing can ever go wrong. I mean, if we had to have the same type of safety level that we have in nuclear reactors today on cars, I guarantee you there would be no cars on the road. It would be impossible to make a car that anyone could buy. It would be more expensive than a car made out of gold, solid gold. So it's the reason why it's more difficult today is because the perception and the regulations are outright crazy.
And that comes back, Thomas Jan, to the slide of the double learning loop. We're busy with the issues that we know, and we're not looking at, let's go back to the assumptions and let's go back and reimagine everything.
Yeah, it's somewhere here, this slide.
It's a mindset thing that we have to really crack with each other.
Yes.
What are really the issues? And once I read that all the regulation is built like it needs to be, if you know that there's a very, very, very small chance of something and you know a solution, you have to immediately build it no matter how expensive. And that makes it that you always every year come with new ideas as a researcher. So every year you will have new things you have to implement.
Yeah. It's like a car, you will get asked by the regulator, is there a chance that the side mirror or the side mirror will fall off? And then the car manufacturer says, yes, there is a small chance that it'll fall off. And then the approval agent says, okay, but you cannot get the car approved until you're shown with a very high reliability, what is the chance that that side mirror will fall off? And it's like, but it doesn't matter. The car is still going to be safe. No, you have to prove that like to minute details. And that's some of the problems in the nuclear industry, that there's no room for reasonable thinking but I think it's coming back. I do believe that we have been down a road where everybody knows that what's going on is crazy. And now we sort of have to make our way back. And I see a lot of people that think this new molten reactors is a chance of being more realistic and more do things in a more appropriate way. But of course, there's going to be a struggle, because there's also still people who make money from this complicated process. And you can say back in the 1960s, back in the 1980s, when the nuclear industry, after Chernobyl, there was not a lot of nuclear power plants built. And I would say it's not so much about Chernobyl. It's also about there was plenty of oil and gas, and people were afraid of nuclear bombs. So there was the entire nuclear movement, the people who are against nuclear, a large part of them admit today that it was not because of the nuclear power, it was because they didn't want governments to play with these materials that could be used for bombs. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable argument. And it still is today. We still have to look for that. But
Thomas,
Yeah.
I would also like to see, because we are already over time a bit,
Okay.
that we have two more questions and one in the chat. So I just want to mention them. I think two of the questions are for other masterclasses, but that I just read them and we can see. And Paul Schalk just said, I totally agree with your explanation, especially because of a lot of people find nuclear dangerous without having any knowledge of it. Those people have a major mark on the nuclear discussion. So thanks anyway. And I think that's a good point. That's why we started this petition and everything, that we start discussing this with people and that we spread the word that if you want to have knowledge first, then you can discuss it, and let's build up the knowledge together and start understanding it. Then the two questions, or the three questions actually that we have is only fuel died that thorium delivers enough energy, but how stable and safe is the process? People have concerns on aggressive molten salt and cycle stability of piping. And I think we should have and we have planned that, I think, a master class on more the techniques and the setup of a molten salt reactor and the safety. So I think that should be in that master class, unless, Thomas, you can give an explanation in 1 or 2 sentences.
I'll try to give a really quick one. Yeah, in traditional reactors, they were built to last for 40 or 60 years. And it is true that it's super difficult to prove that our pipes can last for 40 or 60 years with these aggressive materials. So if that is your view on the thing, then it is a very difficult problem. But if instead you change your viewpoint and say that we only want these reactors to last for 5 years, then it becomes much easier to prove that it can be done. And you know, it's back to this thing about how sure do you have to be about that this is safe. And it's super difficult to prove something that corrosive is safe for 60 years. So I think we have to go the other way and only prove that it's safe for 1 or 2 years, get something up and running, and then people can see. It's much easier to prove that it's safe once it's running than if you have to prove it in a computer program ahead of time.
Yeah, good. And we will have more masterclasses on that. And then one that definitely I think has to go to next time is Jasper with a very good question. Last time in the last masterclass, we referred to storing energy in hot molten salt and how you do that. But he would like to know more about how this works. So we have to think about that, where we can do that.
Yeah, I would like to just make a very quick, so molten salt reactors, what comes out of them is heat. And this heat is basically, it comes out already as a stream of hot salt. So instead of taking that stream of hot salt through a converter where you convert it into rotation energy and then convert it into electricity right away, then you just pump this hot salt into a big tank, like a really, really big tank with thousands of cubic meters. And then you basically just hold it there for however long you need to hold it. And then once you want to convert it into electricity, then you pump it out of the tank and convert it.
Okay. And I really like Paul Curran's remark or question to reflect if we had to test a COVID vaccine for safety, as we would build a light water reactor, how long would we take to certify a COVID vaccine?
Yeah, more than 10 years.
More than 10 years. So that's a good closure. I would like to thank everybody for today. I think it was very insightful, and I find it very exciting to see that, yeah, how you calculate it. It's 3.4 centimeters in the Netherlands for a ball of thorium. And also it was very insightful to look at different countries, where they are with their energy usage and how much thorium you need then to replace it. So that was very insightful. I hope everybody enjoyed it. If you haven't signed up for the petition, please go to start.thorium.today and sign up, and you will get newsletters